afternoon, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this panel. We are in the session talking about machine learning, artificial intelligence. So if you're all here, then we welcome you. My name is Scott Wallace, and I am the moderator for this session. And I am not a remote sensing specialist. I am not a machine learning specialist. My focus is on agriculture development. I work very closely in designing agriculture projects and spent 8 years most recently living in Nigeria, where I fully understand the importance of data gaps and the need for using technology to build transformation in our work. So I'm not going to spend much time on me. I want to talk about this exciting panel that we have with diverse expertise. So let me start by asking each of our panelists to do a brief introduction of themselves. And I'll start with Lindsay Moore. Could you please tell us who you are?
Great. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks, Scott. My name is Lindsay Moore. I'm the CEO of Developmetrics, which is a data science firm that works to break down technology barriers to enable governments, NGOs, companies, and other foundations to really access machine learning and other kind of cutting edge technologies to improve development outcomes. And prior to that, I worked for USAID for 10 years as a foreign service economist. So I was country economist in Bangladesh and regional Caribbean economist based in the Dominican Republic. And then most recently, the senior economist for the Asia Bureau. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Lindsay. Catherine, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. My name is Castro Nakalembe. I'm an associate research professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Geographic Sciences. My background is in remote sensing, agriculture, food security monitoring, and under the university in the NASA Harvest program that's managed out of the university, as well as a member of the NASA Severe Applied Sciences team. My work focuses on applications of machine learning for developing data products from satellite Earth observations that are useful and can be integrated in decision-making processes. So everything, not everything, but working with developing products like cropland maps, crop type maps, crop yield models, yield forecasting, and then integrating those into systems for agriculture monitoring, with a strong emphasis on working with partners within Sub-Saharan Africa and building capacity for institutions to use these data sets. So prioritizing accessibility, scalability, as well as utility, considering things like internet and so on.
Thank you, Catherine. Ariel, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ariel Benny. I'm an associate professor in economics at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I'm also the chief economist at Aid Data, which is a research lab based here at William and Mary. Much of my work and the work of our lab focuses on geospatial impact evaluations. So very much in this impact evaluation world, focused on agriculture. Much of it uses remote sensing and machine learning to look at outcomes in agricultural development. So thinking about everything from the way crops are growing to the way farmers are preparing their land and investing in their land. Spans both economics and geophysical sciences, environmental sciences, and a host of sociology and qualitative work as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ariel. Now, Mercy, could you introduce yourself, please?
So hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Martin Gundury. I work for the International Fertilizer Development Center based here in Nairobi, Kenya, as an agronomist and GIS specialist. So our work cuts across soil fertility, and here in East and South Africa, we work on delivering balanced fertilizers to farmers here in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercy. Charlene.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashleigh Miguna. Just like Mercy, I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I work for an organization called Development Gateway. We're an organization that focuses on the use of data, technology, and evidence to create more engaging institutions. And we also support technology, as mentioned today, such as machine learning, AI, just to support more of the use of data in terms of policy and other key issues on the continent. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Charlene. And last but not least, David.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Garena. I'm an agronomist with QED. QED is a data company, a technology company that builds data systems and AI for applications in agriculture and health, principally focusing on the developing world in South Asia and Africa. My background is in soil science and agronomy, and I principally work on the agricultural side of the work that we do.
Thank you, David. Okay, so let me set the stage. We're going to have Lindsay Moore give us a big picture overview of this whole concept and looking at it from the donor perspective, and much more at the macro level to give us kind of a framing of what we're talking about and where we're going. And if we can have people who are not speakers, please go on to mute. I would greatly appreciate it, or if the moderator could mute people. Thank you. And from there, we're going to have Catherine talk at the what is this, what are its limitations, and we're then going to have some examples from research and out in the field to kind of tie all of this together. So if you have questions throughout, please start putting them in the chat box. We will have people looking at them and try to have enough time at the end to be able to have a very interactive session. So with that said, Lindsay, I'd like to hand it over to you to give us some framing of this topic.
Great. Let me bring up some slides. Can you see these slides all right? All good? Great.
Yep, we're good.
All right. Well, I only have 15 minutes and a lot to get through. So please feel free. I'm going to go over kind of the more macro level data that we're working on with machine learning, but feel free to kind of ask any questions in the chat if you want me to get more of a technical aspect. Some people who might need to be muted. Yeah, great. All right, great. So I'm going to be speaking mostly about predicting agricultural development outcomes with machine learning. And there's really one question or two that I'm going to focus on, which is, can machine learning help predict which development projects will succeed or fail? And so that, I mean, normally when I've done this poll in the past, most people do believe that it will. And that's really true. You know, these days we found that machine learning can actually know how successful a project will be before it's even completed. And the academic literature really converges on this point. There's also a recent study done by Luke Jordan at MIT using World Bank evaluations. And what it finds is that about 80% of a project's success is based on the project design alone. There are other very important factors, of course, like country context, but 80% is really in the project design. So if we can know how to design a project really well from the beginning, we're already setting ourselves up for success in achieving whatever agriculture outcomes it is that we want to achieve. And so the question that we work on at Developmetrics is, okay, so how do we get project design and then, you know, perfect to the extent possible at the beginning? And then how do we kind of improve it throughout the project? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that. And really our approach is we take a very macro ecosystems approach, where our first step is, okay, if we want to know what, you know, how to design a great project, we need to know everything about what has happened in the past. And so that's where we focus, is really taking the universe of development data that's already out there. And I know probably everyone on this call, like me, can be overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there in the field of international development. So how do we take all that information, categorize it effectively, and then use it? And that's really what we work on. And so I'll talk a little bit about the steps quickly, and then I will get into kind of how you can actually use this information. So how we approached this question was really a first step of creating a taxonomy of what in this presentation, I'm using USAID as a case study, just because it's the largest donor, has the most data. But this can be generalizable to any donor or any organization or the agricultural field or any field, honestly, in general. So the first step, which is probably the least sexy step, but to me the most important step, is creating a taxonomy of what is the underlying data architecture of agriculture. And so this actually step took about a year unto itself. If you mute, I think I can do it. Unto itself, to just create this, defining what it is that USAID's been doing in projects. And this is, consulting with stakeholders, reading lots of documents and defining every term very specifically. So I could talk about this slide for an hour, but I'll just move on. I guess the key point here is that, you can put any data set into an algorithm and have some result, but really having integrity and an ethical collection and involving lots of stakeholders, defining the underlying taxonomy for what you're looking at is really important, because these labels are then what's used in machine learning and in defining the whole ecosystem later. So I'll move on from that point, but I'm happy to talk about it. So what is it that we actually do? So how do we take this universe of data and then make it into something that we can actually use to create effective projects? So what we do is we've actually taken every single qualitative document in the development space, in the agriculture space in this example. We started with final evaluations of USAID projects, and we used, based on the taxonomy created with USAID and other stakeholders, we coded, had our agriculture PhD students code projects manually. And what they were doing is they were reading, starting with final evaluations, they were coding every intervention that USAID that's ever appeared in that report and every outcome. And then they were looking at what that evaluation was saying about the interaction between the intervention and the outcome. And they were rating that on a scale of 1 to 4. So how successful was that intervention in achieving that outcome? So over thousands of reports and thousands of data points, you start getting a training set, which then a machine can use to learn to read these reports itself and look at the interaction between interventions and outcomes. And so what we use here is next generation transformer technology. It's very similar. It was the same technology as Google autocomplete. And what you can do is, with a large enough training set, you can then look at the interactions between the words, the vectors, the patterns, and even if one intervention like providing farmers inputs, even if they don't use the word input, the patterns within the text can actually be identified by the machine, which allows you to take all the documents, and you can move to academic articles and other data sets and use them to really take this universe of information and funnel it down into something that actually can help you. And so I'll show you some visualizations of kind of what that looks like, and maybe how you can use it. How am I doing on time? Okay, I have to speed up a little bit. So this is just something that's interesting. What this is what every single intervention that USAID has done over the past 60 years. And so what you're seeing is the percentage of the agricultural portfolio that use that intervention. So for example, here you can see that, and I have to move this, in the kind of early 1990s, the research and development as an intervention was really popular. It made up about 50% of all agricultural projects used research and development. And that kind of makes sense if you think about the trajectory of agriculture development. The Green Revolution was very successful in increasing a lot of productivity and other agriculture outcomes. So it may have risen in popularity. And then you see a really kind of precipitous decline in around late 1990s. And you see here a shift really away from research and development and more towards market-driven approaches like microfinance or kind of more market linkages. And so every single intervention, and there's about 60 of them, has different patterns which you can trace, and you can say, okay, one of the biggest maybe criticisms lodged against development is that organizations are just recycling through the same interventions over and over again without really learning from the past or knowing why why are they are they learning, and are they taking those learnings into the future, or are they just kind of doing the same thing over and over again because of bandwidth or other factors? And here you see that it seems that actually that could be the case, that we're not effectively learning from past projects, because as I'll show you in a second, research and development is one of the most effective ways of increasing, for example, agricultural productivity and a few other outcomes. And so the decline is not necessarily traced to learning of a failure, but really just other kind of external factors. And I focused on research and development here because I know a lot of people in the audience are interested and engaged in that intervention. And so you can really kind of make some conclusions about how important that intervention could be, and also look at some others. But I'll move on from that. So, all these data points come together in some really simple graphics. And that's where I think it's really important to see, how can you in your work use machine learning and use this type of analysis to drive your decision making on a day-to-day or on a strategic level. And so what this graph represents is we're just looking at one outcome. There's about 40 outcomes that in our taxonomy in agriculture. But this is looking at productivity outcome, and the productivity, of course, has a very specific definition. So this is a bit stylized. There's a lot more interventions here, but here it gives you an idea of, okay, what interventions have historically been the most successful at increasing agricultural productivity. And then you can use these are correlations, they're not necessarily causation, but you then can use this to predict, okay, what's going to work in the future. And each bar represents thousands of data points, which are each linked to text. So here you can see example of a text from a document. So you can look at the graph, and then if you want to dig deeper into it, you can then look at the associated text to try to then read a bit more qualitatively, to look at what might be the causal linkage, depending on what your specific question is and what you're specifically trying to look at. And so here you can see, for example, research and development has been very, very successful historically. And so, there could be an argument to increase the use of that if you're trying to achieve agricultural productivity. You can also see training farmers alone or inputs alone hasn't been very successful, but often, so you can look at when you combine inputs and training farmers, then the success of a project at achieving productivity really increases. And there are lots of very interesting kind of connections like that when you combine interventions. Their success can increase or decrease. And here you see cash transfer historically hasn't been so successful at increasing productivity. And that's not to say that, you shouldn't use cash transfers if you want to increase productivity. We wouldn't go that far to make that conclusion. But the idea here is really to then go into the qualitative data and say, okay, well, why hasn't it worked? And so we also have recommendations and lessons learned from, every final evaluation, all kind of academic articles, case studies. So then, depending on your question, if you want to use cash transfer, you can look at, okay, what are the recommendations, and they just kind of get pulled up for you right away. That way, you don't have to read through all these evaluations, and they can also be ranked in relevance to whatever your question is. And I think that's really important, because what we see in final evaluations specifically is that one project will make a recommendation and have some really useful lessons, and then the follow-on project will have the same recommendations and lessons. And I think all of us working in the field can understand, why that is. It's hard as you're implementing a project to keep in mind all the lessons and recommendations from a past project. Sometimes, with the bandwidth, it just kind of slips. And so it's good to have these kind of charts and numbers that can really remind you quite quickly, without having to go and read through all the reports or your notes. And also, people shift around a lot in organizations. So you have that kind of institutional knowledge within the data there that can continue to be built, so you don't have to keep recreating the wheel. I'll just show you one or two more quick examples of how maybe you could use this type of information in your work. So this is another thing that we're able to do then with this is just looking at final evaluations then we can rank them for every single organization. And so this is an organization that I've anonymized, but you can see here on the left, this chart shows how successful they've been on various outcomes. So one is average compared to all other organizations. So you can see this organization is really successful on reducing the level of poverty and developing local institutions, but less successful in kind of WASH or women's empowerment. And then on the right, you can just see the frequency of what interventions they use. And this is often when we talk to organizations, it becomes as a bit of a shock. You know, they think that they're doing better than average on some, or they didn't know how well they're doing on others. And then they can kind of think, okay, well, do we want to just focus then on our strengths, or do we want to, you know, improve our commitment to women's economic empowerment? And then, you know, what are we actually using the most? Should we be focusing on infrastructure and you know, agricultural technology as our main interventions? Or look, we're not really focused on supporting producer groups. So maybe that's something we should focus, and then they can look a little bit more about the success of that. And so, you know, evaluations definitely have kind of some weaknesses. You know, they're not perfect, but they are done by a lot of serious academics, and you are able, through such a large data set that we have, you are able to normalize over time in kind of a Bayesian probabilistic way, just using econometrics and other machine learning. You are able to normalize this, so you can create some really great insights based on just this sheer huge amount of data that we're able to code thanks to machine learning, and that we can contribute, can continue to add to throughout times. Okay, so maybe this is just another, you know, every single project that's ever been done, you can pull up various dashboards. So if you're working on a project, designing one, want to learn from one, you can really quickly see, okay, how successful was this past project? What interventions did they use? What were the outcomes? What are the most similar, you know, projects to learn from? So it just kind of reduces time associated with a lot of the kind of background research that we normally have to do when we're implementing projects. So, I mean, this is really a plea to everyone to think about using machine learning in your work and really benefiting from kind of these insights that it can provide, because these insights are really only as useful as people are applying them. So the reasons you should use these types of approaches is really you can increase the success of your interventions and reduce the risk of not being successful. You know, if you have really analyzed or kind of mobilized this incredible knowledge that's been created over really the past 60 years, then you're really reducing risk that, you know, you're not going to think of something. And you can also then build on that body of knowledge by looking at kind of what are the gaps or what didn't work, what you want to use and improve. And that's really where innovation can come out of. A lot of times when I was looking at, I used to, you know, evaluate a lot of proposals at USA to pick, you know, who should win the project. And we didn't have this kind of quantitative information in proposals that said, you know, we're proposing this intervention because it's correlated, you know, with a 95% confidence level to success of, you know, X outcome. Instead, it was really anecdotal. And it's really important to kind of have shore up these proposals with actual evidence, also complemented by organizational knowledge and you know, personal knowledge. For sure, it's not replaceable, but, you know, it really improves the strength of design, efficiency. You know, you don't have to recreate the wheel every single time you're doing a proposal, and you can keep adding to the data. It also adds, you know, innovation, because you can learn, you know, we often ask for innovation at USAID and people would just kind of throw crazy things at the wall. But you can actually kind of do more informed innovation where you're seeing what didn't work and then you're coming up with a solution to kind of bring that intervention forward rather than just kind of repeating past mistakes. So it can reduce cost and, you know, it really automates labor intensive tasks. So I guess just to conclude, you know, can machine learning help predict which projects will succeed and fail? Yes, you know, we can know that from very early stage. But, you know, this kind of data and predictive analytics are really only as valuable as people are going to use them in their work. And I see that really as a main gap now. You know, how are people actually employing this, not just the project design, but the implementation and the monitoring and evaluation stages. And so I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else on the call kind of talk a little bit more about some of those examples of how they use this kind of machine learning and AI approaches in their work. So my email's there at the bottom. I love discussing these kind of approaches. Happy to get more into the technical details to the extent anyone is interested. And I'll stop there, Scott. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. And I appreciate the framing where we're looking at where the donor community, especially at the USAID level, are putting investments, where we see the potential where investments actually have greater impact. And I'll get back in later on the session to start discussing about this whole research and development and the impact that you're seeing in that space. I would like to take us now up to the space where we have the Harvest Africa NASA lead, and also we're pleased that we have a Global Jubilee Medal civilian of Uganda and Africa Food Prize laureate to give us some framing and context of what is artificial intelligence, what is this machine learning, what are its limitations, and basically from your perspective, kind of get us framed to understand better how we use this in agriculture and how we maybe can in the future. Catherine, I pass it to you.
Thank you. So I will, I guess what I'll try to do is just talk about specifically how we're using machine learning with Earth observations, and kind of just give examples from Sub-Saharan Africa context. Let me know if you can see my screen fine with the nod. So this is work that we've worked on with a colleague of mine, Hannah Kerner, who is our machine learning lead. As I mentioned, my background is largely in remote sensing. And so we work closely together, and we put this together as a way of, kind of highlighting what, for more general awareness, I guess you can think about it that way. So there's definitely a lot of potential when it comes to machine learning applications, but to be careful, I think when we're thinking about like smallholder farmers, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of what some people think about machine learning is not necessarily directly applicable or scalable. So like self-driving tractors or, precision agriculture systems where you have sensors everywhere might not be directly accessible to farmers. So that's kind of one of the things to consider. But like with satellite data, there is a lot of potential to scale and develop really useful data products and reduce some of the more mundane labor-intensive type of work. For example, if you see here in the image on the right, there's extension agents collecting yield data in Kenya, and they have to do this, for example, for so many plots. So there is potential for machine learning with Earth observations to reduce some of that work. So some of the applications more generally, I'll go really quickly. We have cropland, crop type mapping. So generating information about where crops are growing is really important for a lot of things, including as input to agriculture statistics, input to yield forecasting, conditions monitoring. We have, it's just an example of how you can use machine learning to develop models specifically for like crop type mapping. So there's an example from Ghana and South Sudan. Another use case could be field boundary delineation. So drawing these boundaries everywhere. If you've done any work in an agricultural field, you know that this is really, really hard work. And being able to automate some of this would help a lot. And we can do work along those lines with machine learning. There's yield estimation, so forecasting yield conditions using a combination of multiple satellite data sets. So from satellites, we have rainfall, temperature, soil moisture. Combining that with crop type, cropland maps, you can generate really a decent forecast for that could be scaled across really, really large areas. There is work going towards disease and pest identification, or looking at anomalies. Extreme events, for example, could be one use case. But like if there's a disease somewhere that's been, I don't know, assessed and discovered somewhere with, with the right kind of models. There's an example of using, for example, computer vision to detect specific disease. So think about places where people might not necessarily know what the disease is. There are, real clear ways where this could be applied. But there are certain things that have to be considered when you are talking about the promise of the applications of these sorts of things. And one is that having multidisciplinary teams that bring together different expertise is important. So while you might have good remote sensing, good machine learning, you need agronomists, you need people who understand regional context, you need to understand systematic context. And this is important, otherwise the information that might come out might not be as useful as you'd hope it would be. The other is the context of the stakeholders. So if you're trying to deliver data to farmers, don't put it in a web interface. Perhaps there is a more simplified way of delivering that information. If you're developing machine learning modules or models that are data intensive or require extensive internet, they probably won't work in a rural setting, or it's just too expensive that an institution will not even take it on. That's some of the consideration to put in place. The other is working with stakeholders from the very beginning. While it might be really nice to have your model, that's really fantastic. If the end goal is to have it applicable and useful for a specific institution, it's better to kind of start with them to build towards that. From a more technical standpoint, having what we call label data can be a huge limitation. So while we can show really nice maps of crop land maps and crop type maps, for example, for the US, where we might have a sufficient amount of label data, it's very limited in a lot of the areas that, for example, we are working like in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a huge limitation for how the models perform. That's something that people have to be aware of. Making models and methods transparent and reproducible. So while somebody can show you a really fantastic map, if you cannot reproduce their results, it introduces a lot of questions, and that limits how that can go beyond, moving forward. There is, this is a big topic right now, but just being aware that we're working with organizations that need to benefit directly from the work, rather than taking data and bringing tools or taking data without any real collaborative work stream, or without a bigger objective. I think it's important to consider this. Partnerships are important, of course. Making sure that you work with institutions within the countries or organizations or regions is absolutely critical. And I think for, just kind of thinking about opportunities or other things that, that have to be done in order to make this technology transferable include, for example, making sure that the institutions you work with can institutionalize the investment. So if you develop a model, you have to make sure that there are people on the other end who are going to use it with the right skill set, that there will be data and infrastructure, the data that are required to keep the model running or working properly within season. For example, if you're looking at current season conditions, those need to be in place. Otherwise, there would not necessarily be a real solution. And then it's interesting that this was on the initial slide for opening the session, this image right here on the right. And we have this here because it is just important to communicate the limitations, to not overpromise the capabilities. So while it might, while in a farm in the Netherlands might have all the instruments that are required to tell you specifically how much water a crop might need, this might not be feasible in a lot of areas where we have, majority of the farmers in the world. So being able to know that and then understanding at what level product is useful for that context is absolutely important. So as well as communicating that model performance or accuracies and what the data actually mean is really important. Understanding things like resolution. So if I show you a cropland map that is 20-meter resolution, that will not tell you where your farm starts and stops, but it could tell you generally about what the conditions are in that area. And I say generally, you might not be able to use it to distinguish specific crops. You might not be able to understand the different mixes in the ground, but that data is useful, and it is important to communicate that. And obviously, there's a lot of opportunities in terms of research to develop better models that are scalable. I'll be happy to discuss this a little bit further with those that are interested. So yeah, I think that is my interjection, I guess.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And it's a great segue because you just started talking about research and applications for research. And I would actually have Ariel kind of take it from there and talk from the aid data perspective as chief economist, how aid data uses machine learning in their research activities.
Thanks, Scott. And yeah, that was a great segue. Much of what I'll say echoes and builds on much of what Catherine just discussed. My focus is very much on the use of remote sensing and using machine learning to be able to basically bring those Earth observations to the practice of impact evaluation. And in that sense, it touches closely also on what Lindsay was talking about in terms of trying to understand and predict where we're likely to have the greatest impacts in our next interventions as we're considering them. Impact evaluation, as I think about it, is really the practice of trying to carefully form a counterfactual or a comparison group that lets us really carefully understand the causal mechanisms and impacts that the agricultural interventions that we're considering are having. And the use of remote sensing in that setting is opening a whole set of new opportunities. Catherine just showed you lots of really cool cropland maps. So being able to tell what crops are being grown in particular fields, that's a really important outcome measure when we're trying to think about agricultural extension efforts that are helping farmers transition to higher value agricultural crops, right? Or helping them transition to improved seeds. Being able to tell whether what's being grown on the field is still traditional maize, or if it's improved varieties, or if it's altogether new crops, whether those are onions or tomatoes. That's a really important set of outcomes for us. And the field is able to do that now relatively well for some crops, but we have a long way to go. And so this is kind of an exciting area for research. And as Catherine said, in much of what I'll talk about, the big limits for us are what we call labeled data, but this is really, ground observations, whether those are coming from, direct field observations or surveys of farmers and farmers. I'll come back to that point in just a moment. But being able to tell, of course, what crops are being grown is a really important step in the causal chain as we think about most interventions. But there's lots of other important outcome measures for us as well. Many of our interventions focus on the soil and how it's being prepared, whether it's being tilled or not, whether farmers are planting in ridges or in pits. And then, of course, what inputs are being used alongside of this or throughout the season. All of those are things that we are exploring, right, with remote sensing. And to both Catherine and Lindsay's points, the shortage is certainly not on the Earth observation side, on the kind of wealth of data that we have to bring to this. It's really on the reliability of the ground observations and being able to tie those. So for us to be able to kind of use the remote sensing, the satellite-based observations and drone observations increasingly well, what we really need to do is to tie them increasingly carefully to ground observations, whether again those are coming from farm surveys or household surveys, direct observations, site visits by agricultural extension officers, And so that's a big focus of ours right now. And again, a big area where we're using machine learning is to try to leverage the survey data that we do have to do this. And, again, as I think both Catherine and Lindsay highlighted, a big advantage of machine learning is being able to most efficiently use a small set of data that you really believe in and relate it to a much bigger data set that's out there in the world. And so that's where we're really using ML, I think, most prevalently right now. A good example is that, for many of these development interventions, that the ultimate thing we really care about is how well off the farm households are doing, or how well off they are. And so in that sense, we're caring about how much they have to eat, right? What the conditions of their houses are. And so in many cases, the ultimate outcomes that we're thinking about are the wealth indices that we might have for households, or the consumption that they have at their disposal. And we're trying to relate those from surveys of these households to remote sensing. So whether that's, Landsat observations or increasingly higher resolution observations. And that's, again, a place where ML is really powerful, because there are more and more surveys being done, but they're still incredibly rare, right? They're being done for subsamples of countries and relatively infrequently. And so the ML is letting us essentially kind of fill in many of the observations over, say, an entire country, rather than just the cluster sites where sample surveys might have been done. Or, over time, whereas, a survey might be done in 1 year, we can go back multiple years now, or go forward in some cases, multiple years, using ML and remote sensing. So it's kind of leveraging that rare ground data that we have. But it's also really important that that ground data is very carefully linked to that remote sensing. So, that the precision that we have on where these surveys are being carried out is adequate and is being shared. So, lots and lots of ground data has been collected over the years, but in many cases, we just don't know where that actual survey took place. And so that's kind of, in some ways, a plea to all of you as you're thinking about collecting new data on the ground, that you're capturing the locations of those interviews, and to the degree you can, of the farm plots that are being discussed as well, as carefully as you can, even if you're not yet sure how you will use that, because there are opportunities to then tie that together again with remote sensing to predict all sorts of outcomes. And I think for the really exciting for me is that really exciting point for me is that this has the chance to really move the field of impact evaluation dramatically. Again, it's going to let us expand the range of outcomes that we're considering in agricultural impact evaluations. It's going to let us do more long-term impact evaluations. So not just thinking about conditions at the end of a project, but also tracking the longer tails of impacts, 5-10 years down the road. So in many ways, we can go back and do much of that work now, looking at projects that were carried out a decade ago and tracing out their impacts using remote sensing powered by ML. It's going to let us expand the scale of our analysis of climate conditions. So in many of these cases, our projects that we're studying with impact evaluations have relatively small geographic footprints. Even the largest randomized trials, right, are being carried out in a few regions of a country. And often that's not enough to really understand how climate conditions are going to affect the impacts that we're seeing. If we can extend that geographic coverage and the geographic samples in our impact evaluations to cover, entire countries, that really then lets us be able to better understand what role climate is going to have in driving impact changes. Catherine also mentioned this. I think it's super important for us to be thinking about how to integrate remote sensing and machine learning into information that gets fed directly back to farmers and lets farmers make decisions on that basis. Of course, again, recognizing the limitations of the precision and accuracy of this, but tying the impacts that we estimate in impact evaluations back into, again, the hands of individual farmers. And then finally, it's also super powerful in contexts that are otherwise very difficult to survey. So remote sensing lets us better understand conditions, say in conflict-affected regions or regions where it's really costly to survey. Again, when we don't have that many observations already and for impact estimates. So this is a really exciting moment to be talking about all of this. Lots of opportunities there. I think from the research perspective, much of what I've described is in fact an ambitious research agenda with maybe a few kind of examples in each of the buckets I described that are already underway. But really, excited to see where this goes in the next few years, and happy to chat with anyone or connect with anyone about any of these directions. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ariel. And I think you've stoked some questions from the audience that we will be getting back to. You've talked a little bit about how we need to be looking at how we gather data differently. There are also questions about is machine learning replacing people's jobs, and what do we need to do about that? So we'll also get back to your questions. But I would like to now move to our next panelist, who's going to talk a little bit about a specific case approach. There was a question about, has there been anything looking at supply chains in the agriculture sector? And we do have a couple of speakers that will speak specifically on that. One area of import is regarding our soils. What is the quality of our soils? And how do we get better intelligence on that? So I would like to ask Mercy to talk a little bit about their SMART approach. Mercy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. So my focus is going to be on utilizing this big data and machine learning algorithms and technologies that we've heard from the three speakers, and how we use those to deliver balanced fertilizers to smallholder farmers. And here at IFDC, we use the SMART concepts, which I'm going to elaborate more about. So just to give you a little bit of background, I know not everybody is familiar with what balanced fertilizers are, but just like human beings, plants need a balanced nutrition. And fertilizers replace nutrients removed in the harvested products. And as you can see from here, you can see that a lot of nutrients are lost in grain and stover from the maize plant. And most fertilizers supplied to African smallholder farmers only supply the NPK, which I've just highlighted there, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and small amounts of secondary nutrients and micronutrients, which actually, if applied to the soil, can greatly improve yields, but these are not usually available to the farmers. So this is a picture that was taken from one of the farms IFDC was working on in Mozambique. And as you can see, applying just NPK on the left gave poor growth characteristics, which meant lower yield, versus a more balanced fertilizer with added secondary and micronutrients on the right. As you can see, the maize plants look very good. So now, what's the challenge? The challenge is to bring better fertilizers to smallholder farmers, most of who cannot afford or cannot access analytical services, and are also purchasing the fertilizers in small volumes, and pretty much are growing a variety of crops under different soil conditions. These are smallholder farmers who own even less than 5 acres of land. So at IFDC, we apply the SMART concept, which is a conceptual framework for delivering improved fertilizers to smallholder farmers in Africa. And the S in the equation or in the concept stands for soil analysis. I'm not going to dwell much into this because we understand that quality soil analysis is key. That's probably and pretty much the initial stage of this SMART concept. And the M is for mapping nutrients so that we're able to identify deficiencies and soil acidity constraints. And then we have the R, which is for recommendation development, where fertilizers are validated and refined to ensure they're meeting to the farmer satisfaction of greater yields and higher profits. The T is for transfer to farmers, where the technologies are transferred to end users, which for our case is the farmers. And this requires that we work with national extension, farm fertilizer projects, fertilizer industry, regional blenders, international suppliers. We also get donor support to do this, lime industry, and experts in fertilizers and private industries who sometimes work with the governments. So pretty much the R&T, the recommendations, development, and transfer to farmers need adjustment in fertilizer regulations and policy to accommodate the balanced fertilizers into a rather competitive market. So I will focus on mapping because this is where the big data and machine learning tools are needed. And I'm not going to repeat or go into the technical part of mapping. I'm just going to give you a highlight of what the mappers do. So mappers are important visual tools. As you can see, we have a very nice, pretty map there. But how essential is this? Maps influence policymakers to understand the need for diverse fertilizers and lime products. As we said, we start from soil analysis, and once we get this, then the soil is analyzed, we get the nutrients in the map, then we need to map those. And those are the ones that are able to guide the fertilizer industry regarding the extent and location of the various deficiencies. So to produce these maps, we apply digital soil mapping technologies. So after soil analysis, we're able to acquire the training data, and along with other environmental covariates like climate and topography, these are fed into a predictive model to produce soil property map. So we mostly apply the geostatistical interpolation approach, which again, I'm not going to elaborate on, but we are aware that others exist like decision trees, artificial neural networks, fuzzy logic, and knowledge-based inference mapping. And all these apply the machine learning algorithms. Again, I'm not going to delve much into this because I want us to see how we apply at IFDC, we apply these technologies to make sure we are meeting to the needs of the farmers. So these are examples of maps that we have done. IFDC did some work in Rwanda. So where I'm based here in Kenya, we work in East and Southern Africa. We have about 6 or so countries that we work in. And this is just an example of some of the products we've had from Rwanda's work. This was actually done last year. So we're able to come up with nutrient maps, which included the major, secondary, and micronutrients. This was also, so the question comes in, how does IFDC work to help in the recommendation development of the fertilizers? Now we have the soil analyzed, we have the maps. How do we guide these into developing fertilizers? So we carry out, we test new fertilizers, we carry out trials in the field, whereby we work with the fertilizer industry and the government to understand how is the new fertilizer going to perform in the field. And versus whatever was being used previously. And then we also do demonstration plots to attract the farmer interest, whereby we have like farmer field days where the farmers come and see on their own how the plants have performed, how the yield has increased based on the trials that we are carrying out. So this is a picture that was taken from one of the farms for work IFDC did in Zambia. On the right, through application of more balanced fertilizers, as you can see, the farmer was able to get a better response of the maize plants, but with actually a lower application rate of 150 kilograms per hectare, versus on the left, where they used the normal NPKs fertilizer, where they were actually applying a higher rate of fertilizer. So you can see the farmer was able to get higher yields at a lower cost. So this is another example for work done in Western Kenya in collaboration with a fertilizer company called Toyota. From this work, a fertilizer brand called Baraka Fertilizer was born, which saw double yield increase of potato production in Western Kenya in 2017. So pretty much this is just applying the big data, the machine learning tools. Through the mapping, we're able to target areas that need improvement in terms of the soil fertility using fertilizers. And this is how we work with government, NGOs, fertilizer industry to help better that. So in conclusion, use of machine learning to extrapolate the soil analysis, topography, and climate data allows identification of wide-scale nutrient deficiencies and soil acidity problems, and which actually does permit the fertilizer manufacturers and blenders to develop, test, and target balanced fertilizers. And these are the people we pretty much work with. So that's my presentation. This is like a first-hand application of how big data can help impact the farmers' farms, our lives by improving their yields. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mercy. So there have been some questions about the input sector, and I think this is a good starting point to move into our next discussions, which we'll continue on from a different perspective. This is actually very relevant in the sense that the current global situation has had some major impact and effects on the fertilizer prices globally, and is expected to have even more so in the next year or so. So put that into context at the same time that the global consumption has basically plateaued over the last decade, no more than 2% increase per year. Whereas in the continent of Africa, we're seeing an increase of 8% annually increase in consumption. So the market is growing, is moving. And that's also leading to the Africa Union Commission is going to have a summit next year on fertilizer and soil health in Africa. So these changes and the use of machine learning and dealing with the data gaps is front and center in those discussions. So with that said, we have another project that is looking at the data gaps and looking at data in the space. And so I'd have Charlene talk a little bit from her perspective at Development Gateway. Charlene?
Thanks, Scott. As mentioned, yes, I'm Charlene from DG. I'll start off by just saying how agriculture, yes, is a key area of work in Development Gateway. And through my discussion, I'll highlight a particular project that goes by the name of VFAR, so Visualizing Insights on Fertilizer for African Agriculture. And I choose this project because we've done some work on machine learning with this project. And this project, as the name does suggest, has a strong fertilizer focus. But we work with actually a number of partners in this call. But why did we choose fertilizer as a priority in some of our agriculture projects? If you think of it from a policy perspective, implementation perspective, fertilizer is key to address food insecurity because farmers do need fertilizer for the right crops and of course at the right time, for example, the key seasons in Kenya. But for this to happen, seen that data will need to be moved from the current siloed state. So we did a few assessments and we identified that some of the fertilizer data is in particular silos or there's no collaboration across the different stakeholders in the sector because there's no data that can inform key decision making. And beyond that, once there's data availability, moving it into a more palatable state, such as key fertilizer products that Catherine had mentioned that inform key decision making by government, private sector, and all the players that have a key role in facilitating timely fertilizer access and use. So I'll take us back to think about we at Sub-Saharan Africa have the lowest fertilizer usage in the world. What does this mean? This means that we have insufficient fertilizer to replace soil nutrients lost every year to crop production. And of course, that does affect productivity. But we know it's insufficient, but how will we know how much is being consumed without the right data? How will policymakers, private sector, and all the stakeholders we've mentioned be able to plan accordingly and implement accordingly to be able to address key gaps in fertilizer? And that's where the kg per hectare indicator comes in a number of times, which is a crucial benchmark to a country's fertilizer use with the rest of the world. And of course, giving historical context to the challenges different countries are going through in terms of fertilizer use, initiatives that have been done to address such issues and what needs to be done in the future. But if you think about the kg per hectare, that's been discussed in length. I think in 2006, we had a number of African leaders come together, come up with key targets for this indicator. But it's a very complex indicator if you think about it, because it relies on two critical pieces of information that are difficult to acquire. The first is the kg, so that's the total fertilizer consumed. And we work closely in the VFAR project with IFTC through AFO, africafertilizer.org, and they have fertilizer technical working groups where they're able to bring importers, government, and private sector together to validate that section of the data. If you think about it, apparent consumption will need for you to think about what's produced domestically, imported, exported, etc. So there's a lot of complex data that they've been able to bring the different players together to validate this data. But the second one, which is hectares, which equates to cropland that I think Catherine spoke about, has been particularly problematic. And I think she had highlighted some of the issues that different stakeholders have gone through in trying to collect this data. So we're seeing that historically, there have been attempts to map croplands and crop types across African countries. But if you think of an example like Nigeria, where we are working with QED, who'll speak after this, to be able to map, to come up with quality cropland data. Think about the size of Nigeria, and then think about how traditionally those old mapping methods were really hard and cost prohibitive. So key challenges in being able to map such countries and collect accurate, timely data on cropland across such countries. And additionally, I think this was highlighted, mapping initiatives in tropical countries are dominated by smallholder farmers, and this adds onto the complexity of this. So with recent advancements, and I think that's why we're here today, in technology, satellite imagery, combined with machine learning, these technologies have provided rapid and scalable access to high resolution images of the ground. I mean, this is why the VIFA project with all our partners relied on this technology, worked with QED to be able to come up with a pilot for Nigeria that QED will speak about, and we hope to expand this work to our other African countries that we're working in. And I think with that, I'll end up with that because I think we're already at time. But I hope that now you understand why we have the VIFA team focused on the kg per hectare indicator, and my colleagues QED will come to talk about that. And it's more to increase informed decision-making by fertilizer manufacturers, blenders, government, to critically understand and anticipate the demand for products and be able to meet them for the food security, health, and the economy of any country. So over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Charlene, very much. I think it was a great intro to what David is going to be present. And I think David also has a great example where there's a question, will machine learning, artificial intelligence replace people from their jobs? And I think this is a great example of how it complements and deals with data that we have not been able to collect in the past. So David, with that, I pass it to you.
Yeah, hey, thank you, Scott. Appreciate the introduction. Let me get my screen sharing quickly. Okay, maybe Scott, just confirmation that you can see the screen.
You got a thumbs up.
All right, great, thanks. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the introduction at the beginning of the session, I work for QED, and QED is a technology company that provides data solutions for a variety of applications, mostly in the fields of agriculture and health in the context of developing countries. So some of our other technologies that utilize AI are optical character recognition to digitize paper field-based forms. We have some applications for handheld plant spectroscopy for determining plant health in the field, some soil sensors and soil chemical measurement devices that could be deployed also in field. But for this particular presentation, I'm going to be focusing mostly on some of our national scale cropland mapping that we're doing that's really user and demand driven, filling in particular data gaps for specific applications at the national scale. So QED is mentioned is mostly made up of software engineers, but we have a couple of expertises specifically in agronomy, agriculture, and health. And the basic analytical process is pretty standardized. You know, what Catherine mentioned and some of the other people who mentioned Earth observation and remote sensing, it really consists of collecting a bunch of training data, either remote sensing based training data or ground training data, running them through AI that can be able to learn some of the patterns that are being fed from some of the other remote sensing products. And that eventually leads to some type of mapping, whether it's cropland mapping, crop type mapping, plot boundary mapping. So again, this is a pretty standardized process, but I think what we do that differentiates itself is really doing this at scale and operationalizing a lot of the processes and analytics that goes into making these maps. And as Charlene mentioned, we're partnering with IFTC and Development Gateway on a particular project, particular applications for some of our remote sensing work. And this is the VFA, Visualizing Insights for Fertilizer in African Agriculture. And as Charlene just mentioned, one of the key indicators that they're hoping to achieve is fertilizer use per crop or fertilizer use per unit area. And both of these components, both the denominator and the numerator, are quite challenging to acquire. As also Charlene was mentioning, that they're doing a bunch of work on addressing the numerator, which is interviewing various fertilizer supply companies to understand what their importation would be, plus, national governments to be able to identify what some of their importation costs would be. And then we were tasked to do some of the denominator work. So figuring out exactly how much cropland there is in individual countries so they can assess fertilizer use by land area. And our first example was to do some work in Nigeria. The Nigerian government had some previous previous cropland mapping done during the colonial era. So that was really quite outdated, and then updated again in about the 1980s. So there really hasn't been much work to update some of these mapping at the national scale. So we initiated this project a couple of years ago, and were able to produce, fairly high resolution and high accuracy maps. And the area I think that differentiates AI from some of the other components is that it typically would take, let's say if we're going to be delineating croplands by hand using some sort of online annotation tool, it would take maybe about 170 person years to be able to delineate everything across a continent and across the national scale in Nigeria. But AI can be able to automate these processes in a much faster speed. Something that would have taken, again, over 100 person years can be done and executed in a matter of hours or days. So really believe that that's the sweet spot where AI can really help greater efficiencies and some of the historical processes that have been used to monitor agriculture. As I mentioned, we do a lot of operationalizing of some of these approaches. So not just doing one-off, but really creating data processing and analytical pipelines that can be executed on an annual basis to provide constant updates to some of the things that we're seeing on the ground as they evolve year to year. So this is an example of some of our multi-year analysis that we did for VFA. And what they wanted to know is, how does production change on an annual basis? So by looking at different years, again at the national scale, we're able to identify regions where croplands have either decreased, increased, or stayed the same. And as Scott was mentioning, there's going to be a lot of changes to the global agriculture production over the next couple of years. The first one was being driven by the coronavirus, and the latest one is being driven by some of the wars in Europe that are really affecting global food prices and global fertilizer prices. So a big question is, how will this change some of the agriculture production metrics, specifically in developing countries? And then also, how can we then monitor this in real time or near real time to be able to provide governments and other organizations with data-driven insights to make better policy recommendations? The second country that we're looking at with VFA was Ghana. Ghana had some similar issues with previous cropland maps being quite out of date. In addition to that, some of the crops in Ghana that are really important for the fertilizer sector are different than some of the areas in Nigeria where it was more driven by grain and annual agriculture, whereas in Ghana, some of the agroforestry species, so cacao, oil palm, and cashew, are driving a lot of the fertilizer consumption. So in this case, based on the demand coming from our partners in Ghana, they really wanted to differentiate between some of the annual crops and some of the perennial crops. So we're able to produce for them cropland maps along these lines to better assess some of the fertilizer requirements from the government and private sector. And then the last example that I want to discuss is some work that we did a couple of years ago in Nepal, which was the Nepal Seed and Fertilizer Project, which was implemented by CIMMYT from a USAID-based funding in partnership with the national government of Nepal. So this project was really geared towards creating sort of market intelligence for fertilizer that could be used to inform national fertilizer subsidy policy, for, again, the public sector and the private sector. And some of the different metrics that they had to deliver on these promises were to understand really farmer population dynamics. So where exactly are the farmers placed across Nepal? Given that Nepal is really a complicated landscape, understanding this would be really critical to better inform decision-making about which fertilizer should go where. The next one was yield gaps. So understanding that the areas that have higher soil fertility may need less fertilizers, and the areas with lower soil fertility may need more or additional fertilizers, similar to some of the concepts that Mercy outlined previously. And that was related then again to response to fertilizer. So again, back to Mercy's presentation, thinking about, is some areas going to require micronutrients, some areas are going to be fine with just DAP, so nitrogen and phosphorus. And then the last one was access to markets. So where are these areas that have these good responses to inputs, that have high farmer population densities, and can have relatively easy access to the fertilizer market, knowing that easier access typically means lower prices for fertilizers and other imported inputs. So within this project, we really focused on the two components that were highlighted in bold here. So farmer population densities and access to markets. Excuse me. So farmer population densities, we were able to then map out all the croplands, which is highlighted here in yellow, plus all the individual houses across the landscape, which is highlighted in blue. Putting these two pieces together, we're really able to understand where the farmers are and where the agricultural land is, and where are the highest areas for farmer population densities. And within the access to markets, we're mapping out the different road network, both tarmacked road and unpaved roads, to put together access or relative access to market based on sort of access to different types of road networks. And then linking this on top of some layers that the government and other private sector and NGOs have been developing that have access to locational information for agro dealers, for other cooperatives and agro-service provision organizations. So the larger project was able to take this information and combine this information with fertilizer maps, with agricultural inputs and agricultural response to fertilizer mapping, and integrate all these pieces together in sort of a national agricultural data ecosystem, which I'm very pleased to say last year or the year before was formally induced by the government of Nepal, by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Agriculture. So this is a really nice example of integrating a lot of these technology pieces with AI and having it then be an official adopted mechanism by which national governments will be able to make better informed decisions about some of the really important agricultural policy implications. So that's it for me. Back over to Scott. Thanks for the opportunity to present for you today.
Thank you, David. And I think I'd just like to highlight from your presentation that when you were doing that cropland mapping, you were identifying basically real time in a year what was the actual land that was available for agricultural production. And the data that government submits formally on that hasn't changed in the last 15 years in many countries. So this is actually not a way of replacing people's jobs, but it's actually bringing in new data, addressing data gaps. And maybe now that we have just about 15 minutes left, I would like to open up the question about data gaps twofold. In your work, and I'm talking to the panel itself, all the panelists, in your work, where are your biggest data gaps? Where are your limitations? And I want to follow on with Ariel's comment about how you have to collect data differently to be able to use machine learning. So maybe I throw it back up to to maybe start with Catherine. Catherine, could you talk a little bit about that from your perspective?
Like my perspective on how to collect data.
Right. So how we're looking at collecting data differently using machine learning, right? So Ariel talked a little bit about you need a geo-reference. How do we need to look at data collection differently? And then what are limitations in machine learning from your work? Where can you do it? Where is still the next frontier?
I think, fundamentally, I think has been mentioned by at least 3 of the speakers, is that ground data collection is critical, absolutely important, and having I'm going to use the word good representative data set. So if you have different mixes of, different spread of practices, you have mixed cropping, you have large farms, small farms, medium farms, it's important to have a data set that represents that. If you're looking at ground data for yield, for example, you need, to have a good distribution of that, both in space and in time. And I think one of the critical things is it being repeated, that you have so in order to get the value out of satellite data that exists already, you need not only do it properly in space, so across large areas, in a maybe a stratified way that represents these different mixes, but you need to be able to do it consistently. So you find a lot of examples of, there was a huge campaign somewhere in 2019, then there was never another for like the next 10 years or 5 years, or there's one, I don't know, imagined in 50 years from now. So like that kind of stuff, limits what we can do, because we want to be able to monitor and scale. If newer models come available, you might want to rerun it, but if those data don't exist, or if they're from 5 years ago, they're not useful. And so some of what we've been thinking about and have been doing is coming up with ways of collecting data in a way that is rapid and scalable. So the other thing that I think a lot of people don't know about data collection in agriculture, if you're thinking about it from a data science perspective, is collecting that data is really, really hard. So getting a ground truth point, for example, if you're trying to do a crop type map, you need to walk to the field, get a GPS location with the crop type. So try to do that for, let's say, 50 rice fields in Tanzania. In the middle of the summer, it's like 40 degrees C. It's really, really hard, and walking from one to another is really hard. Then add trying to collect yield data, doing crop cuts, cutting out these little things. It's not the same as having combined harvesters in other places where even the harvest is actually collecting the data. So there are those types of applications where you're getting what it's harvesting is being calculated and summed up and whatever. So it's manual labor, it's physical, but it also needs to be done well. So what we've tried to do, one of the projects that we're working on this particular year, we're testing out and trying to scale, is using cameras as you're driving. So you have like we're using GoPro cameras as you're driving. It takes pictures, and then we use computer vision to train a model to predict or tell us what crops are in all those images. So over, let's say a 2-hour drive, you've covered a huge area that you wouldn't be able to cover physically while you're walking with a GPS. But then of course there are other issues, small fields, mixed fields, there are like all sorts of things. So we're trying to work out those types of things, but we're trying to get a huge data set from which we can build. And then going back to the cost, so it's a lot simpler to do it that way, but the cost is also reduced because it takes a lot shorter time. That is, if our pipeline will mature to the level that we want it to mature. So I think those are some of the considerations. There was a question, I think, the consideration of using drones right now that's just been posted. I like this question because I always have the perfect response to it. If you've done, because I have done a lot of drone flights in Tanzania and Uganda, if you have done these, you definitely would not want to invest in a large-scale drone data collection campaign to create a sufficient data set every year for, let's say, crop type mapping, because drones are expensive. To do the flights, you still have to physically go there, set up, fly, go to the next spot, set up, fly. By the time you do that, it's just an incredible amount of work. If you're looking at a large scale farm where you have, the fancy things, all sorts of instruments, whatever, it makes a lot of sense. So you could do a flight every week for your farm. But if you're talking about very large scale regional assessments, in my personal opinion, going drones is probably not the most efficient way, because in the landscapes where I work, just getting from one place to another is too complicated, and setting up, flying and landing, then going the next. I've done this, and we do one 20-minute flight every 2 hours. You have to do it at a certain time of the day, so you can only do like one or two, for example, and that is traveling, I don't know, so many 100 kilometers. So yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. We also had a question, is there applications for organic or regenerative agriculture? I think maybe, David, I'd throw this back to you. I believe that probably your cropland mapping is agnostic when it comes to if you're talking fertilizer or you're talking organic. It's giving you information that helps decision making. But I'll let you answer that quickly. We only have a few minutes left.
Yeah, sure. Well, from our perspective, it's been really demand driven. So the particular use case that I mentioned earlier was for the fertilizer sector, the formal fertilizer sector. But in places like Nepal, the government has really wanted to invest a lot in regenerative agriculture and soil carbon, soil health, organic fertilizers. And in that case, it really depends on what some of the underlying data sets that you're wanting to optimize would be. So integrating some sort of analysis on soil carbon to identify the locations where, greater soil carbon techniques to increase capacity would be targeted would be really important. So I think there's lots of applications. In short, it's just a matter of understanding where the demand is coming from and what are the specific use cases.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Before I get to the next question, I do want to remind the audience to please do the poll before you depart this panel, this session. I'd appreciate it. So there is a question about the amount of data sets you need. There's a comment that you need a huge amount of data sets to actually do machine learning. Ariel, I'd like to throw that to you to address that question. How much of a hindrance is this data need to be able to use machine learning?
I think that's a great point, and I think it echoes some of what Catherine was just talking about as well. Some of the ML-based work that I've seen that I'm already using builds off of standardized data collections that are standardized across countries. We're thinking about the living standards measurement surveys or the demographic and health surveys, right? These are instances where we can pull data from multiple countries at the same time to train these models. And the really interesting thing about them is that they actually seem to perform very well in different countries when we then zoom back into an individual country, even if we've trained it on an Africa-wide data set that's collected, across the continent. Predicting back into an individual country is actually fairly reliable. And so it really is about building, I would say, these large standardized data sets. So to echo some of what Catherine was talking about, the opportunities to collect your own data and how to contribute to this work, I really think it's critical to think about standardizing across settings. So, if you're going to collect some field survey data, interview farmers, to the degree that you can use questionnaires that are very similar to ones that I've used elsewhere, even if it's just a module, that is going to dramatically improve your own ability to predict in your own setting, but also the ability to contribute and build off of what else is going on. Same thing over time. So it's a huge challenge to build and learn about changes over time, especially if we're talking about, over like 2 or 3 year windows in these settings, because there are very, very few reliable panel data sets that revisit the same locations, right, over that time period. As Catherine said, many of these are, once and done kind of efforts, right, cross-sectionals. And so to the degree that you can repeat the questions that were asked of the same sample or repeat the observations made on the same sample, over time, that is going to hugely improve the ability to use that data for the kind of prediction work that you're doing. And again, leverage other data sets that are out there already that are built as panels.
Excellent, thank you. Because we're talking oftentimes of using technology to basically jump into new areas, right? To push the boundaries, to create evidence that we didn't have before. In the last couple minutes, I'd like to get some respondents as far as how do we get that adoption? How do we get people to understand that data? How do we get the trust built into that? And actually get not only government, but donors, as well as private sector, all these stakeholders to understand how do we move that to adoption? And maybe Lindsay, I would have you take a quick stab at that. We do only have 4 minutes left.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. That's my favorite question. Because, you know, in my past, I would write tons of economic reports and nobody would read them. And that was just frustrating, you know, and I think it's the same thing with the data. We can create as much data as we want. And if people aren't using it, then it's not valuable. So, I mean, for us, what we do is, as Ariel was mentioning, the importance of kind of standardizing large volumes of data and then taking that down into a simple graph. A chart. You know, we can spend years on an analysis and what our output will be is a sentence recommendation. And you know, I think it's important to know that you have all the data behind there, that you can go as deep as you want. And often what we do is kind of level it out with a top line statement, and then we can bring it down depending on the importance of it. And also, you know, with machine learning, because it can find the patterns between words, it can figure out, you know, just as Google does, what's the most important to you. Right, so it can prioritize kind of the universe of data in terms of what is the most important to you. So I think sometimes data scientists can get, you know, in love with their models and in love with the data, but at the end of the day, you know, you write it like a New York Times headline, because people are really strapped for time, and so for me, the simplification is key.
Excellent. Thank you, Lindsay. We have just 3 minutes left, so it's really unfair to ask a question at this stage, but I want to thank all of the panelists for putting the time in to get their thoughts together, to get their presentations, to share their knowledge to this large group of attendees. I hope that this has been an informative session. I have definitely learned a lot, and I thank you for your participation, your questions, and look forward to the rest of the program this week. So thank you all. Any final comments in the last 3 minutes? Any burning questions from the panel members or comments, feedback? If not, then I will thank you all and move on to, you can start preparing for your next session.
Thanks so much, Scott. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.